The first thing Tom heard was the wind, thin, restless, threading through the brittle branches above his shed. It wasn't unusual for the late autumn evenings here, when the air carried the smell of damp leaves and far-off woods, but beneath the wind, there was something else. A sound that seemed to belong neither to bird nor branch. A low, uncertain howl, fading and returning like a signal meant for someone who wasn't him. He stepped out onto the back step, boots sinking into the soft earth. The sky was the color of worn tin, daylight losing its grip. The howl came again, not loud, not frantic, but deliberate, with pauses that made it feel almost expectant. He followed it across the yard, past the slanted fence that hadn't been mended in years, to the edge where the orchard met the tree line there. Half in shadow was the neighbor's German shepherd. Its posture was strange, not the forward, bounding eagerness Tom had seen on other days, but something taut, as if the dog's body were holding the air itself still. The shepherd's eyes flicked to him only once before tilting its head upward. Tom followed the gaze. At first all he saw was the tangle of bare branches swaying against the gray. Then a shape, small, rigid, crouched among them. It was a cat, pale fur matted and tail wrapped tight around itself. The animal's eyes were wide, locked downward in the same direction the shepherd was watching. The tree was taller than it looked, its lowest branches out of reach even for someone willing to climb. Between the gusts of wind, Tom could hear the faint scrape of claws on bark. The cat shifted but didn't attempt descent, as if pinned in place by some memory of how it got there. The shepherd let out another howl, not a bark, not a warning, but a long steady note that seemed less about calling to the cat than calling for something beyond the field. Tom glanced toward the road, but there was no movement, no human answer. He took a cautious step closer. The shepherd didn't move the way, nor did it greet him. It simply sat, back straight, head lifted again to the branches. The sound it made this time was softer, almost a murmur, but it carried in the cold air. Tom found himself looking from the dog to the cat, wondering how long they had been like this, the one anchored to the ground, the other marooned above. His instinct was to do something, yet the stillness between them felt like part of a conversation he didn't understand. A crow shifted in the higher branches and the cat flinched, claws tightening into the bark. The shepherd's ears twitched, but it didn't break its gaze. Tom thought he saw the faintest tremor in the dog's shoulders, as if it too were balancing on some edge. Somewhere down the road, faint and indistinct, another sound answered the howl, too distant, too place, too brief to know if it was meant for them. The shepherd's ears pricked, its body leaning into the air as though measuring the distance. The wind picked up, rustling the last stubborn leaves. The cat blinked, slow, deliberate, its gaze flicking past Tom toward something he couldn't see. And in that moment, with the shepherd poised like a sentry and the cat frozen in its high perch, Tom felt the certainty that this was not the first time they had stood like this, and perhaps not the last. The shepherd's howl dissolved into a slow, deliberate silence. Its chest rose and fell, steam curling from its muzzle in the chill. The cat shifted higher into the crook of two branches, the move clumsy and cautious, revealing a tremor in one hind leg. The light caught it just enough for Tom to notice the fur was matted dark along the thigh, not from mud but from something that had dried there, stiff and uneven. The air had a muted stillness, the kind that comes before a change in weather. The orchard's remaining leaves hung limp, and even the wind seemed to hesitate. Tom stayed where he was, a few paces from the base of the tree, not because the climb intimidated him, but because the shepherd's body language was unreadable. It wasn't guarding him, and it wasn't guarding the cat, at least not in the way he first thought. It was watching, measuring. A sudden flicker of movement in the distance caught the shepherd's attention. Beyond the orchard, in the open strip of grass before the tree line, a fox had appeared. Its coat was ragged, tail thin, and its gait was uneven, as if one paw refused to carry weight. It didn't come closer, just lingered at the edge, head tilted toward the soundless tree. The shepherd's posture altered, no growl, no charge. Instead, it stood square, tail lowered but stiff, eyes fixed on the fox with a kind of deliberate patience. Tom could feel the weight of a standoff, but the fox didn't look at the dog, it looked up toward the cat. Rain began, thin at first, misting over the orchard until it blurred the lines between branch, bark, and sky. The fox flinched at the first drops, shook itself once, and turned into the trees without sound. The shepherd held its stance until the fox was gone, then returned its gaze to the cat. The brief moment of tension folding back into stillness. Tom took a step forward. The cat's head tracked him, ears low, body tense but not retreating further. Its injured leg twitched once, involuntarily. He could see now that the wound wasn't fresh. The edges were dull with dried blood, but it had the look of something aggravated, perhaps in a fall. The rain thickened, dampening the bark, making any descent more dangerous. The shepherd circled the base of the tree, slow and methodical, then sat facing the trunk, its back to Tom. Not a guard's stance, but an anchor. The dog's presence seemed to hold the cat in place, not through fear, but through something closer to familiarity. A branch snapped in the distance, muffled by the rain. The shepherd's ears flicked, head turning slightly toward the sound. Tom followed its gaze but saw only the wet shimmer of the orchard fading into the woods. The sound came again, slower this time, as if whatever made it was deliberate about not breaking the rhythm of the rain. The cat pressed lower into the crook of the branch. Its tail, which had been curled tightly around its body, unfurled just enough to sway once in the air, then tuck again. The shepherd did not howl, but a low sound rose in its throat, not quite a growl, more like a hum of acknowledgement. The air felt heavier now, the light dimming faster than the hour should allow. Tom had the sense that he was intruding on a pattern that existed long before he stepped into it. The shepherd, the cat, and whatever watched from beyond the orchard. He reached for the first branch, fingers brushing over cold, slick bark. The shepherd turned its head, just enough to catch his movement, and held him in its gaze. There was no warning in it, no approval either, just a steady appraisal that made him pause. The rain pattered harder, tapping the leaves and the tin roof of the shed behind him. Somewhere beyond the fence, a shape moved too far to define, too brief to track. The shepherd's body tightened, its weight shifting forward slightly, paws planted. Tom withdrew his hand from the branch. Climbing now would mean splitting his attention between the cat, the wet bark beneath his boots, and whatever was moving out there. He stood still, the rain gathering on his collar, feeling the narrowness of the moment. The shepherd's head turned back to the cat. The dog's tail twitched once, then stilled. The cat blinked, slow, deliberate, and for a second its gaze shifted past Tom, toward the orchard's far end. There was no sound now, except the rain. And in that quiet, something in Tom's understanding shifted. This wasn't a rescue in waiting. It was a stalemate, and somewhere just beyond sight, another player in it had already taken position. The shepherd's fur was damp now, darkened along the ridge of its spine, the rain gathering into slow droplets at the tips. It stayed at the base of the tree, gaze fixed upward, as if holding a line that must not break. The cat, rigid on its perch, shifted just enough for Tom to see the tremor running through its flank, not from cold alone. Its injured leg dangled a fraction lower than the other, toes curling and uncurling against the bark in restless pain. A sudden gust bent the upper branches, scattering wet leaves across the orchard floor. The cat's claws scraped hard, muscles tightening to keep balance. Tom saw its ears tilt backward at the same moment the shepherd's body stiffened. Something else was moving, not in the tree, but beyond the fence line, deeper into the orchard's shadowed edge. It was subtle at first, a swaying of grass where the wind didn't reach, a shape that resolved into a low silhouette. A fox, lean and sharp-faced, emerged between the skeletal rows of apple trees. Its coat was muddied, not bright, and its gait carried a limp, yet its eyes locked instantly onto the cat above, and then to the shepherd. The dog's posture changed. No longer patient, it took a step forward, head lowering, chest broadening with the slow inhale of a warning. The fox froze, tail flicking once before curling low. For a moment, the orchard felt like a held breath, rain falling in steady threads between the three of them, the air dense with quiet calculations. The cat's gaze darted between the two on the ground, pupils wide. Its tail twitched, betraying agitation. Tom sensed this wasn't the first time the fox had come close. Perhaps it had been circling for days, waiting for the cat to weaken. If so, the shepherd's constant presence took on a sharper meaning, not a bystander, but it had turned. The fox shifted closer, paws making no sound in the wet grass. The shepherd answered with a deep, contained growl, not a challenge for dominance, but a firm declaration of boundary. Even from where Tom stood, he could see the muscles along the shepherd's legs coil, ready for the smallest movement from the intruder. The rain began to ease, but the sky remained low and heavy. The stillness carried a weight that pressed against Tom's ribs. The fox tilted its head, eyes narrowing, and then unexpectedly it looked up at the cat, not with hunger, but with something else. Curiosity, recognition. The moment was so brief it could have been imagination, but it was enough to unsettle the neat edges of what Tom thought he understood. Then, without breaking eye contact with the shepherd, the fox turned away. It moved back toward the orchard's edge, vanishing into the rows without haste. The shepherd stayed taut for several beats longer, then exhaled, the tension unwinding in its shoulders. Tom's eyes went back to the cat, expecting relief. Instead, he saw it pressed tighter to the trunk, ears low, breathing shallow. The withdrawal of the fox hadn't eased its fear. If anything, something deeper seemed to settle in, a wariness not of predators, but of what came next. The shepherd stepped closer to the base of the tree, tilting its head as though measuring the cat's position. Rainwater dripped from its muzzle onto the moss below. Slowly, it sat again, curling its tail to one side. Tom felt the shift as an ending to this standoff, yet also the start of another threshold. The fox had gone, but its presence lingered. A reminder that the orchard held more than just the three of them. The wind moved through the bare branches overhead with a sound like a slow exhale. In that quiet, the cat's injured leg twitched again, slipping slightly on the slick bark. The shepherd's ears flicked upward at the sound, body tightening. Tom stepped forward without thinking, closing the distance until he could feel the damp breath of the animal at his knee. He looked up into the branches. The cat met his eyes. for a heartbeat and unblinking, glassy stare before looking away toward the direction the fox had gone. It wasn't asking for rescue, it was watching for return. That was when Tom saw it, just above the base of the trunk, on the side facing the orchard. A faint claw mark scored deep into the wood, the edges fresh and pale. Not from the cat, the spacing was too wide. Something else had climbed here recently, and it hadn't been the shepherd. The orchard, once only wet earth and wind, now felt like a map of paths he couldn't see, lines drawn between animals. For reasons he didn't yet grasp, the shepherd stood rigid, every muscle arranged toward the sound beyond the orchard. The drizzle had deepened into a steady, thin rain, the kind that blurred edges and dampened all movement. The cat stayed high in the branches, fur pressed flat against the trunk, but its eyes were no longer fixed on the ground. They were following the shepherd's gaze, pupils tightening as if it too could sense the approach. Through the dim light, Tom caught the flicker of motion low to the earth, deliberate, stopping when the rain shifted direction. A fox emerged at the edge of the tree line, its coat mottled with wet and a faint hitch in its gait. It was lean, far too lean for this time of year. The shepherd did not advance, but its tail dropped low, the tip twitching once. The fox didn't look at Tom, it looked at the base of the tree, then upward toward the cat. There was no sudden lunge, no bared teeth. Instead, it lingered, weight shifting to one foreleg, as though calculating something. The shepherd took a single step forward, a measured move that broke the fox's focus. Rainwater slid from the leaves above, pattering between them like soft static. Tom felt the quiet tension pull tighter. This wasn't the blind aggression he'd half expected. The fox's head tilted, its eyes catching the thin light, and for a moment he thought he saw recognition there, directed not at him, but at the shepherd. Then the cat moved. It shifted its injured leg awkwardly, and the wet bark betrayed it. The slip wasn't far, but enough to scrape its flank against a broken stub of branch. The sound was small, but it changed everything. The fox's ears sharpened, the shepherd's stance lowered, and Tom's pulse climbed in his throat. What followed was not a charge, but a strange retreat. The fox backed away from the tree, eyes still high, then turned into the tree line without a sound. The shepherd didn't follow. It stood until the fox was gone, then circled once at the base of the trunk. Tom knelt near the roots. In the darkened moss, he saw something that hadn't been there earlier. Faint scatter of smaller paw prints already smudged by the rain. They trailed not from the fox's path but from the other side of the orchard, converging here before vanishing into the grass. The cat's breathing was shallow now, its flank moving unevenly. The wound must have reopened worse than before. He could see the fur darkening in the rain. The shepherd glanced at him briefly, then back at the branches. A silent urging. Lightning flared far off to the west. No thunder yet, just the white momentary outline of bare trees against the sky. Tom hesitated. Climbing in this rain was more than reckless, but leaving the cat through another night felt like choosing to let it fade. He pressed his hand to the first branch anyway, testing the slick surface. A small sound came from above, half growl, half whimper. Not defiance, not warning. It was the sound of something too tired to resist but unwilling to surrender. The shepherd paced once behind him, nails clicking softly on the wet roots. Tom made the first pull upward, boots scraping for purchase. The rain thickened, soaking through his sleeves. The cat watched, eyes steady but unfocused, as if seeing something else entirely. Below, the shepherd sat again, facing the road now, ears flicking at a new rhythm in the distance. Through the rain, Tom heard it tootle, deliberate impacts, heavier than a fox's tread. The orchard seemed to narrow around the sound, each raindrop magnifying the pause between steps. The shepherd didn't move toward it, but its body leaned just enough to show it had marked the distance. The cat shifted suddenly, not away from Tom's reach, but toward the far side of the trunk, out of his line of sight. In the wet bark where it had been, another smear of red caught his eye thicker, fresher. It wasn't from the earlier scrape. Something had happened before he'd arrived. Something that tied the fox's strange hesitation, the paw prints in the moss, and the shepherd's unshakable watch together into a pattern he couldn't yet see. He stayed still, balanced halfway up the tree, the rain slipping cold down his neck, listening to the quiet steps drawing closer from beyond the orchard. The sound from beyond the orchard slowed, then stopped altogether. Tom stayed pressed to the slick trunk, one hand braced against the rain-polished bark. The shepherd had not turned to look at him. It remained fixed on that unseen point in the distance, head low, ears tuned to a signal he could not hear. The cat, hidden now along the far side of the branch, shifted once more, and he caught the faint tremor of its injured leg. Then, from the gray blur of trees, the figure appeared, not a predator, not another stray, but a man in a dark coat, walking with the deliberate care of someone who knew the ground well. In his hand, a lead trailed loosely. The shepherd's posture softened, though it did not leave its place. Tom understood this was no random arrival. The shepherd had been calling to him all along. The man approached without haste, stopping a few paces from the tree. His face was lined, not with the easy creases of a smile but with the deeper lines of someone accustomed to waiting. He looked up at the cat, and then down at the smear of red on the moss. When he finally spoke, it was only to the dog, in a low tone that was more acknowledgement than command. The shepherd rose, crossed to him, and stood at his side. Tom reached again for the branch, testing the cat's reaction. This time, it didn't retreat. He moved slowly, steadying himself on the wet bark, until his hands were around the narrow body. The cat was lighter than he expected, its fur sodden, bones sharp under the skin. It didn't fight, only kept its gaze fixed on the man below. When Tom lowered himself and placed the animal on the ground, the man crouched to examine the leg. His touch was careful, but the cat flinched all the same. The shepherd leaned close, nose brushing the cat's shoulder, then stepped back. There was no relief in the gesture, only the quiet recognition of an ending that had been in motion long before Tom arrived. The man nodded once to Tom, not in thanks, but in something closer to understanding, and lifted the cat into the crook of his arm. Without speaking again, he turned toward the road, the shepherd falling in at his side. They moved with an ease that suggested this pattern was familiar. The long wait, the silent return, the watchful walk home. Tom remained under the dripping branches, watching them fade into the mist that had begun to gather where the road dipped. The rain had slackened, leaving the orchard in a kind of muffled stillness. He thought of the fox's paws, the scattered paw prints, the way the cat had never looked at him with the same measure it gave to the shepherd and the man. This had never been about rescue in the way he had imagined. It was about holding a place until the right presence arrived. A gust moved through the tree line, shaking loose a single branch high above. Its leaves, brown and curled, spiraled down onto the patch of moss where the blood had already begun to wash away. Tom stepped back from the tree, his boots sinking slightly into the softened earth, and let the orchard close in around him again. Far down the road, just before they vanished into the gray, the shepherd turned its head, not fully, just enough for its outline to break against the mist. Then it faced forward once more, matching its pace to the man's. The orchard held their absence like a memory, the kind that stays not in the mind but in the air itself, where rain and earth mix into something that will linger for days before fading.